The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, Al Greenfield, is a reading specialist with the state of Minnesota. He'll be talking about ways parents can encourage a love of language and literature in young children and discussing some of the modern techniques for teaching reading. Following Al's interview, we'll be talking with Judith Viorst, author of beloved children's books such as Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Al, I'm so glad you're here today. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, children and reading. As the reading specialist with the Minnesota Department of Education, what do you think is the most important thing both for parents, other adults who work with children, and teachers to think about when they start to wonder about how children learn to read and when they should learn to read?
They really have to understand the role that they play in the first 5 years before the child formally comes to a preschool or kindergarten program, and the amount of growing and learning that that child does in those 5 years has to be really understood by parents. And I think the more we can get that message out, the better that we are. Children are not born with language.
So often parents who say, well, I don't need to worry till my child starts school, they'll teach them to read. That parent needs to know from the very beginning that if you don't read aloud to the child or talk or sing, that child's not going to be very well prepared to learn to read.
No, the child in the home, the child is given all different sounds and concepts that they have to learn in that early life before they ever come to school. If the parent plays games with them, if they talk with them. It really struck me when I was at a conference at the University of Minnesota that one of the major speakers had talked about the two bones in the body that are full grown at birth are bones in the inner ear. So we as human beings are predisposed towards sound. And that's what children need to get in their early life. And they need to hear the sounds and distinguish the sounds, and so that as they grow, if they're in China, they get the sounds that form the Chinese language. If they're in Russia, they get the sounds that form the Russian language. But here we get the English-speaking sounds. So we need the rhythm, the rhyme.
So that's why the old nursery rhymes, even though some of them may not be politically correct, are really good because there is a rhythm and there is a rhyme to that language.
Absolutely. That's why they love the Seuss books also, and the Mother Goose rhymes. They'll bring them, and parents wonder why they bring those books. They don't seem to have any meaning. Parents are looking for meaning. Children aren't looking for meaning first. They're looking for sound, and they're wanting the sound. And if parents think about the jokes that the children do in their young lives, the answer usually will rhyme with a word in the stem of the joke. It has nothing to do with the meaning. It has everything to do with the sound that the words were making.
One of the books you brought today is a poetry book, and it's not the kind of classic poetry that I think adults sometimes wish that children would read, and probably the kind of poetry that turns kids off, but it's funny poems that knows and
yes,
the kinds of words that are sort of vaguely bordering on vulgarity, but
yes,
but the things that create that enjoyment of the sound of words, which transfers to the love of the written word.
Yes, and to remember that children are children, and that the way they respond are children. They're not adults that have the meanings already of the words. Sometimes parents too, and that's the other thing I think parents have to understand, is they ask their children questions and they expect responses. Well, children weren't born with words. If they haven't hit that concept or that idea, they have no words to say. And one of the key things is, the child's sick. So what's wrong with you? Well, their favorite answer is, I don't know. And they probably feel it but they don't have a word to say what's wrong with them because they haven't been sick that often to know what the word is for feeling that way or being sick. So that's a key.
So how can parents help children develop that kind of vocabulary?
By reading to them, by talking to them, by taking them on field trips, by playing games with them. I think of one of the games that politically incorrect is Old Maid, when we sit there and we put them, and the child will say, I can't hold them all, so clear off that table, and then they start to put them down, and then they're making pairs. Well, yeah, you got a match. And then the mother says, well, we have to have a match to light the fire. Well, there you got two different concepts. And then they have to make a pair, and they put pears in salad. And then you've got another different concept for that child. They weren't born with that. And then they go from playing Old Maid to authors or go fish. Now it's 4, not 2. And so now you have a set, and then they're told to set the table. Well, that kind of growth only happens if parents interact with their child by talking to them, reading to them, taking them on field trips, and just giving them the activities that go along with language.
Well, you've been a reading specialist with the department for a long time. Have you seen a change in what's happening with children's reading over the years? I know the Department of Education has done some research, and periodically you publish reports of girls' reading abilities and boys, I think in 4th, 7th, and 9th grade. Mm-hmm. What do you see as a progression or a trend?
One of the things that I think we are seeing is that the gap is getting wider. Programs like Sesame Street, Electric Company, Barney are excellent programs if parents in the home support them and do the additional things with those programs.
So you don't just sit there and let the child watch the TV, you're talking about what's going on.
You're giving them the puppets, the hand puppets, and you make the child talk and take the part. You're playing the game with them. And some of the children who don't get the books, don't get the games, only see it on TV and don't get the interaction of the talking and the flowing of the language, and that makes them less ready and the others more ready when they come to school, so that learning gap is wide already in kindergarten. There are children in this United States of ours that have been read to storybook way less than 30 hours in 5 years. That's less than 6 hours.
As a children's librarian, that just makes me sick to my stomach.
Yes, and then they come with fewer than 4,000 to 6,000 words, and they don't know the concepts of the things in the house, and they don't have the labels for those. Then there's a 5-year-old that comes with over 10 to 14,000 words. There you have a child who knows the language, the working of the language, the drawing of the pictures, and it's such a contrast when you
and
get
these
them
children are often in the same classroom, and
Yes.
then what happens to that classroom teacher with
That's the challenge of the teacher, to try to get them. And the other thing is that the challenge of the teacher is to bring those children along, all of them along, and to think that gap is going to close is a tough thing to think about, because if the teacher is really a good teacher, the better the teaching, the more language develops in all of the children, so the gap keeps widening. And we know the old formula. Ted Clymer, a reading specialist years ago at the University of Minnesota, professor there, said reading range equals 2/3 chronological age, which means that when they're 9 years old, there's already 6 years difference between the best and the poorest reader. When they're 12 years old, there's 8 years difference. When they're 18 years old, there's 12 years difference. The better the teaching, the dynamics of language causes that range to increase. It isn't that those others can't do it, it's somebody's got to take the time
to be with them. Well, one of the things that when I started as a librarian, we worked with people who use the library, people who enjoyed reading. We're doing much more outreach now, and we find that for parents who never enjoyed reading or were never read to as children, the thought of taking their child to a library or buying or reading a book is kind of foreign. If they didn't ever have fun with it, how could it be fun? And so it's been a real exciting thing to see as we do more outreach, that parents see their very young children reacting with a great deal of enthusiasm to a picture book, and that brings those parents in. So it's our hope as public librarians that we'll be working more with the schools so that parents will see that not only do they need to expose their children to books as preschoolers, but to keep on reading with that child
as they go
throughout
through
school.
school and support the reading. Yes, no, that's another key, that parents not only have read to them prior, but when they're in school to ask questions and to bear with, if you will, when the children get to be about 7 years old, all of a sudden the jokes start to come. Because now the child starts to like books that have play on words, because they're starting to understand that pair and pear. Oh, yeah, all of the animals came to the picnic in pairs except the worms. They came in apples. And then they laugh because they know the difference in the meaning of the word. It sounded the same.
Is that why the Amelia Bedelia books, for instance, are so popular?
Yes, they become very popular.
Well, that brings up another whole different point. What about parents who not only read to their children but are sort of obsessed with the children learning to read before they start school? So we have a lot of requests in the library for a series called Hooked on Phonics, which I understand is not quite as good as it's cracked up to be.
You're absolutely right. If there's anything I would say is, don't buy Hooked on Phonics. Spend the $200 to $300 that it costs. Spend it on books and on pencils and paper, and read to the book and let the child listen to the sounds and make their own books and put them together and explore the language in that way, because Hooked on Phonics is saying all there is to reading is the sounds, and that's not true. The child needs language first. They need to get the meanings of words. They need to figure out the sounds of those words and explore that. And just by hearing those sounds as those 8 tapes in those books go, it doesn't work.
So if the child has no concept, for instance, I don't know, castle. If you've never heard a story about a castle or seen a picture of a castle, sounding out castle means nothing to that child?
Means nothing to that child. There's nothing to hook on to the prior experiences in that child has. They make the sounds, but what does it mean? There's no.
Well, before we started taping, we were talking about other very simply written books that children who are learning to read, there is that desperation. They want to read so badly, and it's real hard to make the connection. So you have the books with the cat sat on the mat,
Mm-hmm.
or the books that we joke about from our childhood, the See Jane Run. But there is, I think you called it a niche. That there is a very short time in a child's life where those books fill a need, but then what?
Then they need to go on to more books, because a child likes to feel, I've read a book, I've read a whole book, and some of those books. Well, Seuss was a master of that. The Cat in the Hat, or Green Eggs and Ham, 250 words or only 50 words. He was challenged to do that, and he did it in a repetitious kind of a way of doing it, and it does the repetition. But if a child's going to read that, they have to see language patterns, and they have to have it simplified first, and then they pick it up, and then they can broaden themselves on. So at that point in time, so there's 8, 16, 20, 28 books that have that pattern. They'll eat them up in one night, and then they're on to other things, and they're wanting to have excitement in books and color and pictures too. So there is a niche for those, but don't expect those books to do everything. There's got to be
Well, an
pictures.
example is a recently published series, the Bob books, which are just very simple line drawings, and the whole idea is that children who are learning to read will just, as you say, eat those up, and then after that.
They either have to create their own, or go to the public library, or to a bookstore and find the ones and make their own books. It's a key to also making their own books, because I think the Bob books that we see out there, they're good, and they started from the idea that they wanted to make their own books and put them together in a language experience kind of way. And then this little series was put together so they could say, I read. They're very simple. Sam sat, Matt sat. I mean, they're very simple books, and they can be read. But once they're read.
Well, do you think, talking about the writing experience going along with learning to read, that actually it would be better for a parent and a child to work on their own Bob books than to spend a lot of money buying a series that you'll read once or twice?
Yes, you could have the series and then make your own with them and expand and put the words that they would know and go with in their own books too. That's a key.
Well, getting Dr. Seuss, I think, is fun because parents can stand to hear it a limited number of times. But there are also the illustrations done with a great deal of humor and zaniness and just that silly humor that you talked about earlier.
Yes, and that's what the children enjoy so much too. They like to see the pictures and the things and the excitement of the pictures that are in those books. And even the Richard Scarry Pictionary books and the concepts that the children learn. They see the item, they look at the word, they start to understand, oh, that's the word that is that item. And that's the part from 0 to 5. If parents only knew that the amount of words and concepts that those children learn.
Now, we haven't mentioned the T word, technology. And I think it's like everything else. Technology is important. We can't deny that it's going to be part of a child's life from now on. But internet isn't going to help a child or a student who hasn't learned to read, I don't think.
No. We have found, I also work not only with children but with adults, and the adult who hasn't learned to read isn't going to also learn from the screen without some interaction. There's going to have to be a person there. It takes oral language, it takes the hearing, the listening to the sounds, the making of the letters for those sounds, and all of that interaction that happens. Even in an adult who hasn't picked that up, they have to go back and go through that process and figure out that alphabetic principle. Oh, for that sound, there's this letter that makes that sound. And children do that through their invented spelling first, and parents don't like that word, but then it's invented temporary spelling, and then they have to start to know the correct spelling. But the part, if they're getting the initial consonant right, the beginning right, and the ending right, they learn phonics, and they haven't learned it from a skill sheet. They've learned it from their own practice of language, their own making of books, and working with the books in that kind of way. And that's a key. That's just the key in the interaction.
That's very exciting. So when we get back to this whole idea, the basics really are, you don't think the book as we know it is going to be gone and before our careers are over.
No, we're seeing the excitement of Barney coming in with technology and the videotape and books on tape. But if a person's going to learn to read, they're still going to have to within themselves hook the listening, speaking, reading, writing vocabulary, and that's going to take a human contact. That's going to take some lap books and some drawing and artistic work on the part of the child, and refrigerators to put up, and grandmas to say, oh, I accept that, and that's great, tell me about it. That's the process that needs to happen.
So it's just that the basic common sense, loving relationship with children that parents and adults have always hopefully had to continue.
Yes, and there are just some excellent authors that do that too. I think Judith Viorst is an author that has poems for parents and their children, and I read that one a great deal in PTA parent-teacher meetings also. And parents enjoy them as well as the children.
Well, the humor, if a parent gets a kick out of reading a book, the child is going to enjoy that, and it brings it in. Well, you mentioned Judith Viorst, who is also one of my favorite authors, and who can ever forget the trauma of Alexander and the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. And she was recently in our studio, and we have a very short 7-minute interview with one of what I think must be America's funniest authors. And let's take a look at Judith Viorst. And Al, thank you very much. You're serious but funny too.
Thank you.
I appreciate you for being here today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Judith Viorst, you certainly have broken ground with your children's books. 10th Good Thing About Barney was one of the first books that dealt in a very realistic way with death for young children, in this case the death of a pet. Your books, I think based on your own children and your life as a parent, have been enormously popular in public libraries. And I understand in March of 1994 you have a brand new title coming out.
Yes, I had a lot of fun with it. It's called the Alphabet from Z to A with Much Confusion on the Way. And it's an alphabet book for kids who already know their ABCs. And it came up because I always said if I wasn't born in the United States, I'd never be able to pronounce or spell English because it's so outrageous. So it's told from the point of view of a very irritated kid going through the alphabet backwards and saying, you know, K is for kiss but not cuddle, and J is for jewel but not gem. It could drive you insane. And why is it EAR for ear and EARLY? Why isn't that early instead of early? I just have a lot of, why is physical fitness starting with 2 different letters?
I never thought about that, but those are obviously the kinds of things that children do think about and worry about.
Absolutely.
And if you can tap into that questioning sense that kids have the way you have in your other books.
Well, this also has 52 spectacular illustrations in full color by a man named Richard Hull. I've never met him, but I'm so awestruck by his illustrations. I have written him 3 fan letters. So I think, I think it's a really knockout book.
Who's publishing it?
Athenaeum. And they've been publishing all my children's books for years, and they do a beautiful, beautiful job.
You've maintained as an author the sense, I think, of what it is to feel like a child. The poetry, and if I were in charge of the world, certainly reflects that childhood experience, and not in a sentimental way or a way of an adult looking at a child, but through a child's eyes.
Well, I hope so. I was a children's book editor for 3 years, and long before I had children, I always loved and revered children's books. Always wanted to write children's books even before I had any children. So I come to them with a tremendous amount of respect for what the possibilities are. And I do tap into the kid in myself. I particularly loved writing If I Were in Charge of the World because I could range over a whole series of emotions. And I've completed a second book of poems for kids, which will be out in 1995, which covers a lot of other issues. I always have a poem on sibling rivalry and anything I write for adults or children. So there's one in the new book called Not Altogether Sincerely, I Love, Love, Love My Brand New Baby Sister.
Well, there's a sibling rivalry, I think, in most of your books. And again, it's the very real part of family life, but yet that connection is there, that affection.
Yeah. I raised 3 sons, and I learned not only about my own sibling rivalry with my sister, but the sibling rivalry between Anthony, Nicholas, and Alexander, among Anthony, Nicholas, and Alexander over the years.
You were brave. You used the boys' real names in your books, and obviously real situations. Did that ever bother them when they were growing up?
The only time I ever no, actually, Alexander, I've written 2 Alexander books, and I think Alexander in his bachelor days was using these books the way men in the 19th century were using etchings. Come on up and see my children's books, honey. So I don't think it was a real problem. In fact, he wanted me to write a 3rd Alexander book at some point. And all these years later, I have come up with an idea and just finished a new. So I now have a trilogy of Alexander
And
books.
It will be Alexander as a child, not Alexander as a grown-up.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So the grown-up young men don't mind you talking about their childhood exploits, and have you exaggerated some of them, or are
yes,
they all...
I mean they are all. I write fiction. I do not write the story of my children's lives. I take experiences and concerns they have, and then go with them and explore them, take them into fiction.
But they are universal experiences. I love the grumpiness of Alexander and his mother's reaction to it. And I think there's a scene in the book when he keeps saying he's going to be car sick and no one believes him, and indeed he is.
Yes, well, Alexander is somebody who, when he was a little kid, would come limping home from school saying, oh, I hurt my knee, I'm in such pain. And I'd say, poor baby. You know, in soccer, and you say no. In French, he fall off his chair in French class and get a knee injury. This was a person who really needed a book about having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, because he did have a lot of them.
This is a book that we in the library enjoy using with adults, particularly child care providers and teachers, because there's not one of us who work with children who don't empathize both with Alexander and with you, the parent. It's viewers, I know, are going to wonder what are Alexander and Anthony and your other son doing now. Are they willing to share that information?
Yes, I think they are. Our oldest son, Anthony, now called Tony, is a public defender in Denver and married and a terrific young man. Our middle son, Nick, is working in publishing in New York, and our youngest son, Alexander, is married to Jane and living in Chicago, and he works for a bank doing community lending. And both Nick and Alexander are also just, what can I say? They're wonderful. They're wonderful young men, all 3 of them, and they've gotten past the sibling rivalry days where they are each other's biggest fans and boosters, and if anybody has good news, they will get their most heartfelt, warm reaction by calling up a brother and telling him about it.
That's a wonderful inspiration for parents who are sharing these books now with their children to know that someday that is
it doesn't
going to
seem,
happen.
it doesn't seem possible. You think there's going to be bloodshed whenever they get together for the rest of their lives, but they do get past it.
Judith Viorst, thank you very much for this short interview on All About Kids.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith Viorst, an author who's as interesting to talk to as her books are to read. And thank you, Al Greenfield, for the expertise you shared with us today. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.